Hey there, welcome to another Path of Exile guide, this time with a skeleton Mage Necromancer. Ritual League brought some much needed buffs to this lesser known type of minion, and before you ask, yes, this build is better than the melee Skelemancer. The build will be rated on 5 different categories: defense and survivability, mapping and clearing speed, bossing and single target damage, cost, and viability as a league starter. Defense wise, you should be able to hold your ground and survive most encounters, definitely what has now become sort of mid-range content such as red tier maps. The build is also naturally defensive due to its playstyle. You don't need to be anywhere near actual combat, as you can summon your skeletons at range and they themselves are ranged as well. In addition, enemies will be too busy fighting your undead army rather than yourself, so you should be quite safe as long as you stand back and let your minions soak up most of the damage. When it comes to map clearing, the build does fairly well thanks to the large number of skeletons, each firing 3 piercing projectiles. And since these are ranged minions, they'll be much more effective than, let's say, melee skeletons who need to travel to their targets before unleashing their damage. This aspect also makes the overall gameplay smoother, as you don't really need to aim and you can summon your skellies in the general direction of the enemies. On top of that, you can run literally all map modes, boosting your farming efficiency by quite a bit and enabling you to quickly progress to the Atlas. Bossing is actually one of the stronger suits of this build with excellent real applied damage. While on paper a lot of builds will have greater DPS numbers, for most their damage becomes 0 the moment the character needs to move. Your skeleton mages, however, will stick to their target like shit to a shoe and they don't actually follow you around. This means you can focus solely on staying alive, moving out of arena hazards and dodging boss moves while your minions keep firing their projectiles. Still, the biggest selling point for this build is actually its cost, as even most of the best in slot pieces of gear will be dirt cheap even in the early days of a new league. In fact, at the time of recording, in the middle of the current league you can get this build to red tier maps with 100 chaos orbs. The low price, coupled with the fact that the build uses very few mandatory uniques, most of them really common ones, also makes it an excellent league starter. Add one of the fastest and carefree leveling processes in the mix and you've got yourself a winner. All this being said, the build was not designed or intended for the absolute hardest content in the game. You'll very likely find it very hard, if not impossible, to clear stuff like 100% delirious maps or Maven special fights such as the Feared or the Hidden. However, you can't realistically expect that level of performance for such a low price. This build is a mid-range one, aimed at more casual rather than power players. Before diving into the guide proper, just a reminder, if anything is unclear or you have any questions about the build, you can find me streaming on Twitch at twitch.tv/Navandis, link to the schedule in the pinned comment and video description. I'm live 4 or 5 times a week and you'll get to see every upcoming build being put together, leveled up and fine-tuned before it becomes a guide such as this one. Finally, the most up-to-date path of building link will always be found in the pinned comment and video description. As usual, the guide is divided into 7 main sections: build overview, passive tree and leveling, ascendancy, pantheon, gems and links, gear, flasks and jewels, and finally pros and cons. So with that out of the way, let's start with a build overview. The build's main skill, Summon Skeletons, normally creates a number of melee minions, but by using the unique threshold jewel, Dead Reckoning, up to 15 of those will be transformed into skeleton mages. The skill summons a random assortment of 3 different types of mages, cold, fire and lightning, but on average you should get an equal amount of each. By default, the lightning mages deal the highest damage, followed by fire and then lastly cold. To my knowledge, however, there is currently no way we can prevent a certain type of mage from spawning or convert their damage from one element to another. Since it's not really efficient to try and focus on all 3 elements at the same time, the build instead primarily scales the skeleton's lightning damage and to some extent fire. This is done mainly with auras such as Wrath and Zealotry, but also Elemental Equilibrium Keystone and Elemental Weakness Curse, both applied through cunning use of the recently introduced Hydrosphere spell. Another really important piece of the puzzle is using a Val Summon Skeletons gem instead of the default one as soon as you can. Val gems are basically a 2-in-1 kind of deal. When you equip a Val gem, you get both the regular skill, in this case Summon Skeletons, as well as a Val version of it, which is a similar ability but much stronger. The Val skill has a cooldown and also needs soul charges, which will be gathered as you or your minions kill mobs or damage bosses. It summons more than 40 additional skeletons, dramatically increasing your damage output. While these skeletons won't follow you around either, the ability is incredibly powerful in fixed combat scenarios like boss fights, rituals, legions, blight encounters, delve nodes, etc. Finally, the build uses quite a few additional minions, such as Animate Guardian, Spectres and Zombies, whose sole purpose is to provide various buffs to yourself and the skeleton army. While that's quite a bit of info to unpack, I'll go into greater details in the passives, gems and gearing sections respectively. And speaking of that, let's actually start with a passive tree and leveling. You start off as a witch, and for the first 20-25 levels you can level up using Summon Raging Spirits or as a pure spellcaster using Freezing Pulse or Arc. I've added a few good leveling setups in the Path of Building guide, so check those out if you need it. After that point you can switch to summoning skeletons, either melee or mage ones, depending how soon you can find or buy a Dead Reckoning Jewel. There's actually very little difference between the two types while leveling. As for the passive tree, most of the time you'll balance between minion damage nodes and passives that provide life or defenses for yourself. For example, early on, nodes such as Lord of the Dead, Enduring Bond or Death Attunement will increase both the minions damage as well as the maximum number of skeletons, zombies and spectres you can summon. On the other hand, passives like Heart and Soul, Cruel Preparation or Purity of Flesh are exclusively for your own benefit, providing a large amount of life and some resistance. As soon as possible, you'll also want to obtain a Dead Reckoning unique jewel that will transform your melee skeletons into mages, and you can socket it right above the Elemental Equilibrium keystone. And speaking of that, this keystone alone will be responsible for about a third of your total damage output. With it, when you deal damage with a certain element, let's take for example Cold, Elemental Equilibrium increases that monster's cold resistance while lowering their fire and lightning ones by a very large amount. Remember how in the overview section I've said you have 3 different mages, one for each element? Well, with this passive you're basically buffing the strongest two and weakening the already weaker element. You'll be doing this by casting Hydrosphere, which hits enemies with cold damage, but I'll go over that skill in the gem section. Another important aspect to keep in mind about Elemental Equilibrium is that your minions do not trigger it in any way, as it's your passive not theirs, but they will benefit from the resistance reduction debuff on enemies. Now let's talk a bit about the cluster jewels part of the tree. First we have a large cluster jewel, and the most important passives you're looking for are Renewal and Call to the Slaughter. Now unfortunately, as a third passive there's only one available option that adds anything to this build, and that is Feasting Fiends. Getting all 3 might be a bit more expensive, so you can initially just look for a cluster jewel with the first 2 strong passives and any random third. Upgrade from that when you can afford it. On medium cluster jewels, the 2 most important passives are Blessed Rebirth and Life from Death, both crucial for keeping your skeletons alive. With these, newly summoned minions are immune to any damage for 4 seconds. They also recover 4% of their maximum life when another minion dies. Now the catch is, summoning skeletons beyond your maximum limit will replace the oldest ones, but that also counts as minion death. So by cycling your minions, they'll have a pretty long invulnerability window and receive massive heals. Since the build uses 2 medium cluster jewels, it's much cheaper and more efficient to have Blessed Rebirth on one jewel and Life from Death on the other. The second passive on each medium cluster jewel can be Renewal, Feasting Fiends or Dread March. And finally you have 2 small cluster jewels, and the best option here is the usual Fatal for a massive HP boost. Other decent and much cheaper alternatives are Surging Vitality, Peak Vigor or Prismatic Carapace. Do try however to get some HP on at least one small cluster jewel. As for Deal with the Bandits quest in Act 2, for this build you need to kill them all. The bonuses they provide are pretty much useless for summoners, so the 2 passive points are clearly the way to go. And that's about it for the passive tree and leveling. In the next section I'll be covering the Ascendancy class, which improves pretty much every single aspect of this build. Summoning dead stuff to fight for you is clearly the signature of a Necromancer, so that is what you'll be picking up as the Ascendancy class. First points go to Mindless Aggression, a clear-cut and efficient passive. It simply buffs the damage as well as cast speed and movement speed for minions, nothing really complicated. After completing Crew Labyrinth, follow up with Unnatural Strength, which grants +2 levels to all active minion gems you're using. While this doesn't seem like a big deal, keep in mind that minions actually gain most of their damage and HP from gem levels. Even if this bonus doesn't apply to support gems, having higher level skeletons, zombies, spectres and animated guardian will make them much stronger and resilient. Third in line is Commander of Darkness. Both yourself and your minions get a large amount of damage and cast speed, as well as elemental resistances. While the damage bonuses are useless for you, 30% to all elemental resistance will greatly help with gearing, allowing more flexibility in choosing useful unique items. Finally, with the last Ascendancy points, take Bone Barrier, a really strong defensive layer for both yourself and your minions. First, you get a whole bunch of physical damage reduction, life and energy shield recovery. Your minions also gain 20% increased maximum life, a stat that you can never have too much of. In addition, you obtain the Bone Armor skill. When activated, it creates a shield on yourself and each of your minions, which absorbs up to 2200 damage from hits, removes bleeding, and provides immunity to this ailment while the buff is up. Just remember to actually place this skill on your hotbar and use it as often as possible. The way I personally use Bone Armor is to bind it to my left mouse button, replacing the default move. As I keep the button pressed, it moves my character as usual, but also casts the spell on cooldown without interrupting movement. With the Ascendancy out of the way, we can take a quick look at the Pantheon choices. Generally speaking, Pantheon choices are situational and there isn't a best pair that will outperform all others in any scenario. However, there are certain options that complement specific builds quite well in a wide range of situations. For this particular case, here are my recommendations. For the Major God, Soul of Lunaris. It provides quite a few bonuses to evasion and chance to dodge, as well as physical damage reduction and movement speed. In addition, you'll avoid any projectiles that have chained. While this might not seem like much, keep in mind there are close to 30 minions around you at all times and projectiles can potentially chain from each of them to hit you. As for the Minor God, the optimal choice is likely Soul of Grathkul. Since you'll still end up in melee range while doing arena type of content like rituals or Maven's Crucible, you'll likely receive a significant amount of hits. Reducing enemies' attack speed as well as incoming physical damage will definitely keep you somewhat safer. Having covered the Pantheon choices, we can now focus on one of the most important aspects of any build, gems and links. Heist League has introduced alternate qualities for both active skills and support gems. These provide different bonuses than the default versions of the gems, and in some cases they might add a bit more damage or utility. While none of these are mandatory nor do they add a lot of DPS, you'll find alternate quality gems in the Path of Building Guide Aid. Some might be dirt cheap while some might cost over 50 chaos, so it's up to you if you wish to invest anything into them. With that out of the way, as usual I'll start off with the main skill, Summon Skeleton and its support gems. Support gems are listed in order of their importance, so if you can only get a 5 link, then just drop the last gem. As mentioned in the build overview, get a Val Summon Skeletons gem as soon as possible, as the Val ability will dramatically increase your damage output. In fact, this gem alone will trivialize pretty much all the boss encounters during the campaign and even into maps. If you can't find or buy one, you can try corrupting a regular Summon Skeletons gem using a Val Orb. Lastly, getting a level 21 gem is a huge deal and one of the very first upgrades you should be looking for. It increases the level of your skeletons, in turn boosting their life and damage by a pretty big amount. But more importantly, it will allow you to summon one additional skeleton when combined with a natural strength passive from the Ascendancy. Moving on to supports, first there's Spell Echo, which will repeat each spell cast by your skeletons and it will drastically increase their cast speed as well. Not only that, but you will actually directly benefit from this support as well. Each time you cast Summon Skeletons, the spell will repeat, which means you'll get 8 skellies out instead of 4. Then you have Lesser Multiple Projectiles, which adds 2 extra projectiles for each mage, greatly boosting your clearing speed and efficiency. Against bosses, replace it with Hypothermia support for a large single target DPS increase. Follow that up with Minion Damage, which, as the name suggests, just adds a whole bunch of damage, and Pierce Support Gem. Pierce allows the skeleton's projectiles to, well, pierce their targets, so they'll deal damage to multiple rows of enemies, further improving your clearing speed. Even this support can be replaced in boss fights for an even bigger damage increase. You can swap it for either slower projectiles or control destruction if you get a wide socket on your weapon. Finally, the last gem in this setup is Elemental Focus, trading your skeleton's ability to apply elemental ailments for a massive damage bonus. Skeletons already have a very low crit chance as it is, so applying ailments would have been unreliable at best. Next we have the support army setup, starting off with Raised Zombies. You spawn these minions from corpses and their main purpose is to act as a meat shield around you and trigger the Feeding Frenzy buff. While they do deal a bit of damage of their own, that's not their role in this build, and even if a couple of them die in a boss fight, you shouldn't focus on resummoning them. Then the second gem in this setup is Raised Spectre, another really cool minion which is summoned using the bodies of dead monsters. As the name implies it, this minion is a ghost of that respective monster and it will inherit all attributes and skills it had while it was alive. Since you're not looking for damage dealing specters but rather ones that will help your other minions, the best option is to use 3 Karnish Chieftains. The Chieftains periodically cast a spell which grants frenzy charges to all allies. These in turn provide a great deal of damage and cast speed, perfect for your skeletons. Since you're recycling your skellies every other monster pack, you definitely need all 3 chieftains to keep up with the frenzy charges generation. Yes, they are better than Host Chieftains, Arena Master, Crabs, Day of Tool or whatever Spectre you've seen in other builds. For this particular build, which uses non-permanent minions, using 3 Carnage Chieftains is optimal. Carnage Chieftains can be found in Act 2 Old Fields map, and it's not necessary to actually kill these mobs to obtain their corpses. It's enough to teleport in this area and cast Desecrate, and this will spawn corpses that belong to that zone. Hold the A key pressed and then select the appropriate corpse, then cast Raise Spectre. And that's about it. The good part is that once a certain monster has been added to Desecrate's corpse pool, it will appear when using the skill in other areas or your hideout. Anyway, don't worry too much about this entire process, since Spectres will die very rarely, if at all, unless you really mess something up. Now coming back to a gem setup, so far I have Raise Zombies and Raise Spectre. The third gem is Blood Magic. This allows your Spectres to spend a small amount of life instead of mana to cast their spell. This is necessary because they have a tiny mana pool which would otherwise be exhausted after casting Mass Frenzy once or twice. Then there's Animate Guardian, one of the most interesting minions in the game. The Guardian is summoned by casting the spell on items dropped on the ground, which the resulting minion will actually equip and use. As such, you want to give it gear that grants bonuses to allies, aka you and the other minions, but I'll go over the best items for Guardian in the gearing section. For now, I'll mention that it can use weapons, shields, helmet, body armor, gloves and boots. However, be warned, if the Animate Guardian dies, all its gear is permanently lost. While leveling, only give it random rare items or cheap uniques that you don't need or would otherwise vendor. However, just because I've seen this happen so many times before, do not take your Animate Guardian into Halls of the Grandmaster's map. That's a PvP map and your Guardian will die and you'll lose all its gear. Finally, add Feeding Frenzy and Meat Shield support gems. The first one will grant a 44% chance to linked minions to generate the Feeding Frenzy buff when they hit an enemy. This in turn boosts the movement speed, damage and cast speed of all minions, even those that are not linked with a support gem, in this case, your skeletons. Meat Shield greatly reduces the amount of damage these support minions take and gives them a chance to taunt enemies on hit. This is actually a pretty good additional defensive layer for yourself, as they will peel off enemies that would otherwise keep attacking you. Up next is your aura setup, and the only way you can fit all of them is if you're using the recommended best in slot helmet, Devouring Diadem, as aura socketed in it will reserve significantly less mana. This is comprised of Zealotry, increasing spell damage, Wrath, boosting lightning spell damage in particular, and Summon Skitterbots, applying shock and chill ailments to nearby enemies. Not only will chilled enemies act slower, but this also enables you to use Hypothermia in your skeleton setup against bosses. Link all the auras with Generosity support to increase their effect and have them to no longer apply to yourself. This is actually quite a useful side benefit, as you don't want to deal lightning damage, which would mess up with the Elemental Equilibrium keystone. The next 2 gem setups are mainly used in boss fights and static combat scenarios, such as rituals. They add a great deal of damage, so use them whenever you feel like your skeletons are struggling to kill tougher targets. First one is comprised of Arcanist Brand, Desecrate, Flesh Offering and Blade Blast. Arcanist Brand is a special type of spell which will attach to nearby enemies and begin casting other linked spells. If the target dies and the brand is still active, it will jump to another target. While you can summon 3 brands at the same time, only a single one can be attached to a target at any given time. However, that's not really relevant in this case, as all the spells it needs to cast are area of effect ones. Desecrate creates several corpses, which are then consumed by Flesh Offering, providing a massive cast speed and movement speed buff to nearby enemies for about 10 seconds. Blade Blast's sole purpose is to apply the Unnerve debuff on enemies, increasing the spell damage they take from any source. The other damage boosting setup is made out of Hydrosphere, Hex Touch, Elemental Weakness and Flame Dash. While Hydrosphere can do a lot of other stuff, I mean, look at that wall of text, its purpose in this build is just to hit enemies with cold damage and trigger Elemental Equilibrium. It also applies an exposure debuff on enemies, lowering their lightning resistance. We linked it with Hex Touch, so it will also cast Elemental Weakness curse on enemies it hits, further reducing their resistances. In fact, with a single cast of Hydrosphere, any enemy hit by it will have a massive minus 104% lightning resistance penalty and minus 94% fire resistance. Needless to say, it's absolutely crucial to cast both Hydrosphere and Arcanist Brand against bosses. Besides, after you've summoned your skeletons, what else are you gonna do anyway? Finally, Flame Dash is just your mobility skill, but it will actually also trigger Elemental Weakness curse if it hits an enemy. There is one last extremely useful gem you need in this build, and that is Convocation. It summons zombies, spectres and animated guardian around you and gives them a large life regeneration buff. It might not seem like much, but it's practically one of the only ways you can directly control your minions. It's a crucial tool for pulling them out of dangerous places, helping them navigate rooms and doors, or to simply bring them to your aid if you're getting hammered. However, you can only fit the skill if you're using an unset ring which has a socket as its implicit. If you can get 2 unset rings, then adding a Chaos Golem will increase your physical defense by quite a bit. With the gems out of the way, it's time to take a look at the recommended gear for this build. In this section, for each gear slot, I will outline 3 tiers: basic, mid tier and best in slot. Generally speaking, prices increase significantly with each tier, but so do the benefits that the items bring. With this build, you don't really care about any kind of affixes that add damage to yourself, but only ones granting resistances, attributes, defenses and maybe some minion damage or movement speed if you can afford those. The Notes tab in the Path of Building guide contains trade links to help you find and buy the necessary gear. You can tweak the filters according to your budget and character at the time. Your main goal is to cap your resistances and get as much life as possible while equipping as many of the best in slot unique items as possible. Starting from the top, a very good basic tier helmet is the unique Skull Head. It provides decent life and resistances along with a whole bunch of defensive stats for your minions, keeping them alive while you progress to the harder content. As for mid tier and best in slot, the optimal choice is Devouring Diadem, which should be relatively cheap beyond the first week of a new league. The first great bonus it provides is 20% reduced mana reservation cost for auras that are socketed in it. This allows you to squeeze in Summon Skitterbots, a critical component for the build. In addition, it has the Feast of Flesh ability, an automatic skill which triggers every 5 seconds and consumes up to 10 nearby corpses, healing 400 life for each corpse. In most heavy combat situations, this translates to a 4000 life heal every 5 seconds, an amazing defensive mechanism. On top of that, Devouring Diadem provides Eldritch Battery Keystone. With this passive, you first spend Energy Shield to cast spells instead of mana. This in turn allows you to reserve your entire mana pool with auras, as you don't need to save any mana for summoning skeletons or casting other spells. Moving on to your weapon, for basic tier the best option is the Queen's Decree Two-Handed Sword. It provides bonuses to minion life and damage, as well as 1 extra skeleton, zombie and spectre. You can also use it from level 27, so it makes for a great leveling weapon as well. In fact, this item is so good that it can serve as a mid tier one as well, until you get the best in slot weapon. As for best in slot, the optimal choice is Femurs of the Saints staff, a dirt cheap and common unique. First, it comes with +2 levels to socketed minion gems, so make sure you slot your summon skeleton setup in it. Not only will the Scalies gain a lot of extra damage and HP from 2 additional levels, but the staff can also roll up to 80% increased minion damage. Furthermore, Summon Skeletons gem has certain level breakpoints which increase the maximum number of skeletons you can summon. The 2 extra levels from Femurs of the Saints will help you reach one such threshold and get an additional skeleton. And to top everything off, this staff provides you a life regen buff for each summoned zombie and increases your chance to block attacks for each summoned skeleton. This is stronger than it might seem at first, as you'll easily become block capped when casting Val Skeletons, which summons over 40 extra Scalies. Up next is the body armor, and for basic and mid tier you're looking at 5 or 6 links, 80 plus flat life and 90 plus elemental resistances. Percentage increased maximum life, chaos resistance or dex would also be great secondary mods to have on this slot. For best in slot, upgrade to a 6 link that has pretty much the same affixes as the mid tier armor, but with the addition of a +1 to maximum number of skeletons mod. This mod can only roll on body armors dropped in Delve, and for this reason it will be very hard and expensive to find one which has other amazing affixes on it. Moreover, you'll likely not find one that is already 6 link, and you'll have to do that by yourself. For this reason, you'll need to cap your resistances on other pieces of gear, so you can ideally focus mainly on life and the +1 skeleton mods here. Moving on to gloves, this will be a slot where you need to squeeze out as much resistance and dexterity as possible. For basic ones, search for 60 plus life and elemental resistances, along with some dexterity or maybe chaos resistance. Whether it's an armor, evasion or energy shield base doesn't matter that much as long as you get the right mods. Mid tier and best in slot gloves need pretty much the same affixes, but with higher numeric values and an empty prefix where you can craft minions deal increased damage using your hideout crafting bench. When it comes to boots, however, there's really a single choice here, and that's a pair of Alberon's Warpath uniques for the +1 maximum number of skeletons. They also come with some decent movement speed, chaos resistance and a whole bunch of strength, boosting your HP and ensuring you have enough to level up any red gems. Moving on to your belt, quite similar to gloves, this is a slot where you should stack up as much life and resistances as possible, including chaos resistance. In addition to that, at mid tier you should try and get a Stygian Vice belt with similar affixes but with the added bonus of an abyssal socket. Even an average jewel will provide much more benefits without breaking the bank. Finally, for best in slot, I recommend another really common and cheap unique, the Darkness Enthroned belt. This item allows you to socket 2 Abyss jewels in it and it will boost all their bonuses by 75%. At a first glance this might not seem like a big deal, but let's do a bit of math. An average Abyss jewel will have around 30 maximum life on it. With 2 of them and a 75% bonus, that's actually 105 life, which is on par with a decent Stygian Vice belt and a socketed jewel. Pretty much the same for resistances, you can easily get 70 or 80 with 2 average Abyss jewels and the belt's bonus. Now here's the catch, jewels can have up to 4 mods and Ghastly Eyes in particular are excellent for boosting your minions' damage. Meanwhile, regular belts have 0 possible affixes that increase minions' DPS. So, not only are you getting a lot of additional damage from a slot that normally doesn't provide any, but you also have the flexibility of going with pure DPS jewels if you've already capped your resistances with other items. With basic amulets, it's the same familiar story, life, elemental resistances, perhaps some dexterity or some chaos resistance. At mid tier, you have the fairly common Jinx Juju. Its main selling point is that 10% of incoming damage will go to your Spectres instead of you, divided among all of them. That might not sound like much, but it's almost the same as having 10% more life while at least one Spectre is alive. On top of that, it buffs the effect of your auras by quite a bit and has a whole bunch of dex and chaos resistance, both more than welcome for this build. For best in slot, above all else you're looking for +1 to maximum number of skeletons, a mod which can roll on either Elder influenced amulets or Delve ones. Add some life and as much resistance and dex as you can afford. Amulets can also be anointed using oils dropped from blight encounters to add a notable passive to them without changing the item in any other way. For this build, my top recommendation is Ravenous Horde, which will increase your minions' damage, cast speed and movement speed, as well as give them a chance to gain an onslaught buff on kill. This in turn will further boost their cast speed and movement speed, a great perk while mapping. If you're looking for a defensive option for yourself, then Golem's Blood is the perfect choice as you get quite a bit of extra HP and life regen. On the other hand, if you feel like you need to protect your minions some more, then Grave Intentions is your best bet. The extra chaos resistance is especially important for your Animate Guardian, as that's probably its only weak spot. Moving on to rings, their sole purpose is to help cap your elemental resistances, get enough dex to level up any gems and as much life as possible. So for basic tier, look for at least 60 plus life and over 60 total elemental resistance. Since you don't care at all about damage affixes for yourself, it should be really easy and cheap to find such rings. Mid-tier ones have pretty much the same affixes with higher numeric values and on an unset ring base. These come with a socket where you can place Convocation and Summon Chaos Golem gems. Finally, best in slot rings are similar with mid-tier ones but with an open suffix where you can craft +1 to minimum endurance charges. This provides a guaranteed permanent endurance charge which you don't need to generate and it's never consumed. In turn, endurance charges grant you additional physical damage reduction and elemental resistances. Up next are jewels, an excellent source of DPS, life for both yourself and minions, and utility. This is doubly true when using the best in slot belt, so don't ignore or downplay their importance. First, there's the obvious unique, the Reckoning, which is mandatory for transforming melee skeletons into mages. Apart from that, you're mostly looking for Ghastly Eye Abyss jewels. The number one priority is to try and get flat life on every single jewel you'll have. The second thing you're looking for on at least one Abyss jewel is minions have a chance to hinder enemies with spells with 30% reduced movement speed. No matter how low the chance, with 10 plus skeletons firing a storm of projectiles everywhere, all mobs will be slowed down. The other equally important special mod is minions have a chance to blind enemies on hit with attacks for your zombies and the other melee minions. Blinded enemies have 50% chance to miss their attacks against you, so this is an amazing defensive layer for such a small investment. Everything else is dedicated to filling in any resistance holes, getting enough dexterity and pure damage mods. I can't list them all here, but you can find trade links in the notes tab of the Path of Building guide. As for the cluster jewels, I've already talked about the passives you're looking for in the passive tree section, so check that out if you skipped it. Here I'll just mention the overall structure of the cluster jewels. The large one should have maximum 9 passives, 3 significant ones, 2 jewel sockets and 3 or 4 minor. The medium cluster jewels should have maximum 5 passives, 2 significant ones, 1 jewel socket and 1 or 2 minor passives. Finally, the small cluster jewel can have 2 or 3 passives, one being a mandatory significant. If the cluster jewels have more total passives than what I've listed, you'll be wasting more points than necessary. Finally, let's talk about flasks. First we need the Seeding Divine Life Flask of Dousing or Curing. Instant healing is a real lifesaver and removing ignites or poisons will really help with your survivability. Normally I'd go with the Staunching Flask for bleeding removal, but that's taken care of by the Bone Armor skill. Second one is a Chemist Basalt Flask of Heat for some additional physical damage reduction as well as freeze immunity. Getting frozen is pretty much a death sentence in high level maps, so this provides a reliable way of preventing that. Third is a Chemist Quicksilver Flask of Adrenaline that will simply help you move around faster. Then you have a Rumi's Concoctions Granite Flask. This is yet another great defensive flask that will greatly boost your chance to block as well as physical damage mitigation with its massive plus 3000 armor buff. Finally, there's an Experimental Quartz Flask of Warding. The additional chance to dodge both spells and attacks is a solid defensive layer on top of stuff like evasion or block. Warding suffix is also mandatory while mapping for curse removal and immunity. Before wrapping up, I'll also briefly cover the best gear for your animated guardian. The cheap setup is made out of Leercast helmet, Dying Breath staff, Victorious Flight boots, ambush charge body armor, and a pair of rare gloves with 80 plus life and 20 plus chaos resistance. For the optimal gear, replace the body armor with Doppelganger for a massive reduction in physical and chaos damage taken, as well as a huge amount of life regen. This is the linchpin for your Guardian's defenses, an item that will make him almost immortal, so don't upgrade any of its gear pieces until you get this one, otherwise you run the risk of your Guardian dying while wearing the other expensive items. The optimal weapon is the amazing Kingmaker Axe. This provides a permanent 45 buff to nearby allies, yourself included, as well as Culling Strike. Keep in mind you can save some currency if you craft the axe yourself by vendoring a non-corrupted Soul Taker axe, a Heartbreaker dagger and a Fusing Orb. Finally, the best in slot helmet is the insane Crown of the Tyrant. This item can have a single socket, and if that socket is blue, it will add an insane amount of base lightning damage to your minions. So whatever you do, make absolutely certain you're first coloring the socket blue before equipping this item on your Guardian. On top of that, this helmet reduces nearby enemies' elemental resistances, further increasing the damage they take from your skeletons. Now, to wrap up the gearing section, here are some excellent leveling uniques which will help you easily progress through the campaign. With the gearing out of the way, it's time to take a final look at the pros and cons of the build so you can understand if it's what you're looking for. Starting off with the pros, an excellent league starter, it's very cheap to gear up for the first few tiers of mapping, and this will help you generate currency quick and get a head start. Really cheap considering its performance. Most best in slot items will cost you just a few chaos orbs, and the only somewhat expensive items in this build are the cluster jewels and Animate Guardian best in slot gear. Amazing overall damage, the build's total output is around 10 million DPS without requiring mirror tier items or sacrificing your defenses. It can run all map modes including Reflect, No Regen or No Leech. Some of these might slow you down a bit, but they're more of an annoyance rather than a blocking point. Great clearing speed, the build is very efficient at quickly killing large packs of mobs with very little downtime. Your scale is to kill everything from afar without having to lead or control them. Superb boss killer, while you won't win any speed contests, you'll be able to kill most bosses in the game. As for the cons, Minions AI is not exactly brilliant. While it has been improved significantly in the past few leagues, there are still some pending issues. The labyrinth and some boss fights can feel quite awkward with all the minions getting in the way and obscuring certain mechanics. Finally, there's the Summoner playstyle. This is not everyone's cup of tea as it might seem a bit lazy or uninvolved. On the other hand, some people want exactly that, and since you've made it so far, I'll assume you're one of them.
Learn anything new, Exile?
If you did, then you'll probably be happy to hear there are more videos coming up in the near future with more exciting builds to try. Make sure not to miss them by subscribing to the channel so you get notified when that happens. And while you're at it, why not like this video as well or drop a comment down below to let me know your thoughts. Thank you all for watching and see you next time.